The teacup slipped from my hands like it had a mind of its own. One moment I was reaching for it on the kitchen shelf. The next I was watching it shatter against the linoleum floor in slow motion, pieces scattering like my thoughts had been doing for weeks. "Mom, you're getting clumsy," David said from behind me, not moving from his chair at the breakfast table. His voice carried that tone I'd been hearing more often lately. Not concern, but mild irritation, like I was a household appliance that wasn't working quite right anymore. I knelt to pick up the pieces, my 67-year-old knees protesting against the cold floor. This was the third cup I'd broken this month. My hands weren't what they used to be, but it wasn't just that. Something had been off since the fall on the stairs 3 weeks ago. Not my balance. That had recovered fine. It was something deeper, something I couldn't quite name. "Leave it. I'll get the broom," David finally said, though he didn't stand up. He was scrolling through his phone while eating the breakfast I'd made him. The same breakfast I'd been making for 42 years. Scrambled eggs with cheese, toast cut diagonally, orange juice in the blue glass he'd preferred since he was 7. "It's fine, honey. I've got it." I gathered the larger pieces carefully, remembering how this cup used to be my mother's favorite. She'd drunk her morning coffee from it every day for 20 years before passing it down to me. Now it was just fragments in my palm, irreparably broken. As I wrapped the pieces in a paper towel, I noticed David watching me with an expression I couldn't read. For a moment, something flickered across his face. Was it guilt? Concern? But then his phone buzzed, and his attention was gone again. "I'll be late tonight," he said without looking up. "Don't wait dinner for me." This had become our routine since his divorce 6 months ago. He'd moved back into his childhood bedroom at 53, claiming it was temporary while he figured things out. But temporary had stretched into half a year, and somehow I'd become invisible in my own home, a caretaker whose presence was expected but never truly acknowledged. I threw the cup fragments away and started sweeping the smaller pieces, the soft scraping sound filling the silence between us. Through the kitchen window, I could see Mrs. Patterson from next door tending to her garden, her husband holding her watering can while she directed where each flower should be planted. They moved together with the easy rhythm of a couple who still saw each other, who still chose each other every morning. "David," I said softly, not turning from my sweeping, "do you remember when you used to help me in the kitchen? You'd stand on that little stool and stir the pancake batter." He made a sound that might have been acknowledgement. "Mom, that was 40 years ago. I know, I was thinking about it." I leaned the broom against the counter and turned to face him. "Sometimes I wonder if you remember any of it. The good parts, I mean." For the first time that morning, he looked directly at me. His eyes, the same green eyes I'd stared into when he took his first breath, seemed different somehow. Distant, like he was looking through me rather than at me. "Of course I remember," he said, but his voice was flat, automatic. "Look, I need to get ready for work." He stood and walked past me toward the stairs, leaving his dishes on the table. I watched him go, noting how he didn't touch my shoulder as he passed, didn't pause to kiss my forehead goodbye like he used to. When had that stopped? When had I become just another piece of furniture in the house where I'd raised him? The stairs creaked under his weight, the same stairs where I'd fallen 3 weeks ago. I'd been coming down with a load of laundry when something made me lose my footing. David had been in the living room, close enough to hear the tumble of my body against the wooden steps, close enough to hear my startled cry, but it was the phone that had worried him most. "Is your phone okay?" he'd asked, rushing to where I lay at the bottom of the stairs, my hip throbbing and my pride bruised. Not, "Are you hurt?" or "Should I call a doctor?" His first concern had been whether my phone, which had skittered across the hardwood floor, was damaged. I'd laughed it off at the time, made excuses for him. He was stressed from the divorce. He wasn't thinking clearly. People said things they didn't mean when they were worried. But lying there on the floor, watching him examine my phone more carefully than he'd looked at me in months, something cold had settled in my chest, a recognition I wasn't ready to face. Now, standing in my kitchen with broken china at my feet and the taste of loneliness sharp on my tongue, I found myself thinking about that fall again, about the strange sound I'd heard just before I lost my balance, a sound that had seemed almost like, no. I pushed the thought away. Some suspicions were too terrible to entertain, too impossible to believe about your own child. The house fell quiet after David left for work. I finished cleaning the kitchen, made my bed, watered the plants on the windowsill, the same plants I'd been tending for 15 years. The same routine that had once felt purposeful, but now felt like marking time. In the living room, family photos lined the mantelpiece like silent witnesses to happier times. David at his high school graduation, beaming with pride. David on his wedding day, arms around Sarah, both of them glowing with hope. David holding baby Emma for the first time, his face soft with wonder. When had he stopped looking at me the way he looked at his daughter? When had I become the obligation rather than the joy? I picked up one of the photos, Christmas morning 5 years ago, before the divorce changed everything. We're all gathered around the tree, David, Sarah, Emma, and me. Emma is holding up a drawing she'd made, and we're all laughing at something she'd said. In the photo, David's hand rests on my shoulder, protective and loving. I stared at that hand for a long time, remembering how it felt to be touched with affection by my own son. If you like emotional stories about family and finding strength in difficult times, please consider subscribing to our channel. We're working to build a community of friends who understand that life's hardest moments often teach us the most about ourselves. And tell me in the comments, from which city are you watching? I'd love to know you're out there, listening to this story with me, because what I discovered next would change everything. And sometimes, the truth we're most afraid to face is the truth that finally sets us free. The phone call came during my afternoon tea, the way important calls always seem to. Uninvited and perfectly timed to disrupt the small rituals that kept my days anchored. "Grandma Evie!" Emma's voice bubbled through the speaker, bright and warm like sunshine after weeks of rain. At 8 years old, she still called me every few days, a habit Sarah had encouraged before the divorce made everything complicated. "Hello, sweetheart," I said, settling back into my chair with the first genuine smile I'd felt all week. "How was school today? We learned about family trees. I drew you right next to me because you're my favorite person after Mommy and Daddy." Her words were like a balm to wounds I hadn't realized were still bleeding. "Can you come to my dance recital next Saturday? I'm going to be a butterfly." "Of course I'll be there. I wouldn't miss it for anything." "Daddy said you might be too tired to come. He said old people get tired easy." The words hit me like a physical blow. Old people get tired easy. I gripped the phone tighter, forcing my voice to remain steady. "Daddy said that?" "Uh-huh. But you're not too tired, right? You'll really come?" "I promise, Emma." Wild horses couldn't keep me away. After we hung up, I sat staring at the phone in my hands. Old people get tired easy. When had David started talking about me like I was already 1 foot in the grave? When had I become old people instead of just mom? That evening, David came home later than usual, smelling faintly of restaurant garlic and wine. I'd kept his dinner warm in the oven, pot roast with vegetables, his childhood favorite, but he barely glanced at it. "You don't need to cook for me every night," he said, loosening his tie. "I'm perfectly capable of feeding myself." "I know you are. I just thought I grabbed something with the guys from work." He opened the refrigerator and pulled out a beer, not offering any explanation about where he'd been or who these guys were. 6 months ago, he would have told me about his day without being asked. Now I had to piece together his life from fragments and overheard phone calls. "Emma called today?" I said carefully. "About her recital." Something shifted in his expression, a tightness around his eyes that I'd learned to recognize as his defense mechanism. "Yeah, she mentioned that. She seems to think I might be too tired to attend." He took a long drink of his beer, not meeting my eyes. "Well, it's a long drive to Sarah's place. And it'll be crowded, lots of noise. I just thought you might prefer to skip it. Since when do you decide what I might prefer?" The question hung between us like smoke from a snuffed candle. David's jaw tightened the way it had when he was a teenager being called out for breaking curfew. But this wasn't about teenage rebellion. This was about something much more calculated. "I'm not deciding anything," he said finally. "I'm just being realistic about your limitations." Limitations. The word echoed in my mind long after he'd gone upstairs. When had I become someone with limitations? When had my own son started seeing me as a burden to be managed rather than a person to be loved? I wrapped his untouched dinner and put it in the refrigerator, knowing he wouldn't eat it tomorrow either. The kitchen felt too large around me, filled with the phantom sounds of conversations we used to have, meals we used to share, laughter that had somehow gotten lost along the way. The next morning brought another small cruelty, delivered with the casual efficiency of someone who'd grown expert at inflicting pain without leaving visible marks. I was in the garden, deadheading the roses that had been my pride for 20 years. when I heard David on the phone in the kitchen. The window was open, and his voice carried clearly across the morning air. "No, she's fine living here," he was saying to someone. "It's actually convenient for me, having someone to maintain the house while I'm at work. She does the cooking, cleaning, keeps everything running." A pause, then laughter. Not the warm laughter I remembered from his childhood, but something sharper, more calculating. "Trust me, she's not going anywhere. This arrangement works perfectly for both of us. She gets to feel useful, and I get free housekeeping and meals. It's a win-win." I stayed very still among the roses, my pruning shears forgotten in my hands. Free housekeeping. That's what I'd become to him. Unpaid domestic help who happened to share his DNA. "The best part is she actually thinks she's helping me," David continued, his voice carrying that tone people use when they think they're being clever. "Like she's doing me this huge favor by letting me stay here, when really, I could afford my own place tomorrow if I wanted to. But why would I, when this setup is so convenient?" He could afford his own place. The words hit me like ice water. All these months, I'd believed he needed me, that I was providing crucial support during a difficult time in his life. I'd felt useful, necessary, loved, but I was just convenient. I made my way back to the house on unsteady legs, the morning's revelation sitting heavy in my stomach like bad food. In the bathroom, I splashed cold water on my face and stared at the reflection looking back at me. When had my eyes become so dull? When had the light gone out of them? David was getting ready for work when I came downstairs, straightening his tie in the hallway mirror with the same mechanical precision he brought to everything now. "I was thinking," I said, my voice carefully casual, "maybe I should start looking into some activities for myself. Senior center programs, volunteer work, that sort of thing." He glanced at me in the mirror, his hands pausing on his tie. "Why would you want to do that?" "Well, you're right about my limitations. Maybe it's time I started acting my age." Something flickered across his reflection. Surprise, perhaps, or concern that his convenient arrangement might be shifting. "I didn't mean you should become a hermit, Mom. I just think you should be realistic about what you can handle." "Of course, realistic." I smiled the same polite smile I'd been wearing for months, the one that covered everything I wasn't supposed to feel. "Have a good day at work, dear." He left without kissing my cheek goodbye. Another small tradition that had died without ceremony. I watched through the window as he backed out of the driveway, not looking toward the house, not seeing me standing there like a ghost of the mother he used to love. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went to visit my neighbor, Helen, who lived 3 houses down and had been trying to befriend me since her husband passed 2 years ago. "Evelyn!" she exclaimed when she opened the door, her face lighting up with genuine pleasure. "What a lovely surprise. Come in, come in. I was just making tea." Helen's house felt different from mine. Lived in, loved in, filled with the comfortable clutter of someone who still believed her life mattered. Photos of grandchildren covered every surface, and the air smelled like cinnamon and fresh flowers. "I hope you don't mind me dropping by unannounced," I said, suddenly feeling foolish for coming. "Mind? Honey, I've been hoping you'd visit for months. Sit down, make yourself comfortable." As Helen bustled around her kitchen, chattering about her garden and her book club and her granddaughter's upcoming wedding, I felt something inside me begin to thaw. This was what conversation felt like when the other person actually saw you, actually wanted to hear what you had to say. "How is David settling in?" Helen asked as she set down a plate of homemade cookies. "It must be nice having him home again." The question should have been simple to answer. Instead, I found myself staring into my teacup, watching the steam rise and disappear. "It's been an adjustment," I said finally. Helen studied my face with the keen eyes of someone who'd lived long enough to recognize pain when she saw it. Adjustment can be difficult, especially when expectations don't match reality. I looked up, surprised by her insight. "Have you ever felt invisible in your own life, Helen?" "Oh, honey." She reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. "Every woman my age has felt that way at some point. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" What was I going to do about it? For the first time in months, the question didn't feel overwhelming. It felt like the beginning of something, not an ending, but a door slowly opening to possibilities I hadn't allowed myself to consider. Walking home as the sun set behind the maple trees that lined our street, I felt something shifting inside me. Not hope, exactly, but something harder and more valuable: determination. David might see me as convenient, manageable, useful only for what I could provide, but he was about to learn that some things once broken, cannot be easily mended, and some mothers, once awakened, refuse to go quietly back to sleep. The morning of Emma's recital, I woke before dawn with the kind of nervous excitement I hadn't felt in months. I'd pressed my best dress the night before, navy blue with small flowers, the one David used to say made my eyes sparkle. In the kitchen, I prepared a thermos of coffee and packed the homemade cookies I'd baked for Emma, wrapping them carefully in tissue paper with a little bow. David appeared in the doorway as I was checking my purse for the 10th time, making sure I had everything I needed for the 2-hour drive to Sarah's town. "You're really going through with this?" he asked, eyeing my preparations with the weary expression of someone watching a child insist on an obviously bad idea. "Of course I'm going," I promised Emma. He poured himself coffee, taking his time with the sugar and cream while I waited for some sign of support, maybe even approval. Instead, he sighed like I was creating an enormous inconvenience. "Fine, but if you get tired, if your back starts acting up, don't call me to come get you. I have plans today." I wouldn't dream of it. Something in my tone made him look at me more sharply. For a moment, I thought he might ask what I meant, might show some interest in my thoughts or feelings. Instead, he shrugged and walked away. The drive to Emma's recital should have been peaceful. I'd always loved driving alone, watching the countryside change from suburban developments to farmland to small towns with their proud main streets and old churches. But today, David's words echoed in my mind with every mile. "Don't call me. I have plans." When had I become someone he needed to warn off? When had my needs become such a burden that he felt compelled to preemptively refuse help? The school auditorium buzzed with the excited energy of proud families gathering to watch their children perform. I found a seat in the 3rd row, close enough to see Emma clearly, but not so close as to make other families uncomfortable. Around me, grandparents chatted with their adult children, sharing photos on phones and coordinating dinner plans after the show. "Is this seat taken?" A woman about my age gestured to the empty chair beside me. She had kind eyes and silver hair swept into an elegant bun. "Please sit," I said, grateful for the company. "I'm Margaret. My granddaughter Lucy is in the butterfly group too." "I'm Evelyn. My granddaughter Emma," I started, then hesitated. What was Emma to me exactly? David's daughter, yes. But what was my role in her life now that the family had splintered? "Which one is Emma?" Margaret asked, leaning forward as the children began filing onto the stage in their colorful costumes. "The one with the bright smile in the front row," I said, my heart swelling as I spotted her. Emma waved enthusiastically when she saw me, her face lighting up with pure joy. The performance was magical. 8-year-old butterflies fluttered across the stage with more enthusiasm than technique, and the audience ate it up. Emma was radiant, her movements confident and graceful. When she caught my eye during her solo moment, she beamed so widely I thought my heart might burst. Afterward, I waited outside the auditorium for Emma to emerge from the dressing room. Other families clustered in happy groups, making plans to celebrate at restaurants or ice cream shops. I stood alone, clutching my purse and the tin of cookies, watching for my granddaughter's familiar face. "Grandma Evie!" Emma launched herself into my arms with the force of a small hurricane. "Did you see me? Did you see my butterfly dance?" "You were absolutely perfect, sweetheart. The most beautiful butterfly on that stage." I handed her the cookies, and her eyes went wide with delight. "Mom, look what Grandma Evie brought me." Sarah approached with the careful smile she'd worn around me since the divorce. Polite but distant, like I was David's relative rather than someone who'd been part of Emma's life since before she was born. "Hello, Evelyn. Thank you for coming. Emma was so excited when she spotted you in the audience. I promised I'd be here." I knelt to Emma's level, smoothing her still glittery hair. And promises to granddaughters are the most important kind. Emma hugged me again, and for a moment everything felt right in the world. This was what love was supposed to feel like. Unconditional, generous, joyful. "Can Grandma Evie come to dinner with us?" Emma asked, turning to her mother with hopeful eyes. The pause that followed was just long enough to be uncomfortable. Sarah glanced around the thinning crowd, clearly looking for an excuse. "Well, sweetheart, we're just going to grab something quick. Nothing special. And I'm sure your grandmother has a long drive home." "I don't mind the drive," I said quickly, hating how desperate I sounded. "If Emma wants me there, I'd love to join you." Another pause. Sarah's discomfort was palpable now, her smile becoming more strained by the second. "The thing is, she said finally. We're meeting some of Emma's friends and their families. It might be awkward, you know, with the divorce and everything. The words hit me like a slap. With the divorce and everything. As if I was somehow contaminated by my son's failed marriage. A reminder of painful times that needed to be forgotten, rather than a grandmother who loved Emma unconditionally. I understand, I said quietly, though I didn't understand at all. What did David's divorce have to do with my relationship with Emma? Why should I be excluded from celebrating my granddaughter's achievement? Emma's face fell. But Mommy, maybe next time, sweetheart, I said quickly, not wanting Emma to feel caught in the middle of adult awkwardness. You go have fun with your friends. The drive home passed in a blur of hurt and confusion. I kept replaying Sarah's words, trying to understand when I'd become someone to be excluded rather than included, someone whose presence created awkwardness rather than joy. At home, the house felt emptier than usual. David's car wasn't in the driveway. Apparently, his mysterious plans were still ongoing. I heated up leftover soup and ate it standing at the kitchen counter, too tired to bother with setting the table for one. The phone rang as I was washing my single bowl and spoon. Mom? David's voice sounded strange, tighter than usual, with an edge I couldn't identify. Hello, dear. How was your day? Fine. Listen, I need to talk to you about something. Sarah called me. My stomach dropped. Oh? She said you showed up at Emma's recital uninvited and tried to insert yourself into their dinner plans. The words were so unfair, so completely wrong, that for a moment I couldn't speak. I was invited, David. Emma asked me to come, and I promised her I would. Right, but Sarah says you made things uncomfortable by pushing for an invitation to dinner when it was clearly a family event. A family event? I'm Emma's grandmother. You're my mother, he said, and something in his tone made my blood run cold. Sarah's family is her decision now. You can't just show up places and expect to be included. I didn't just show up. I was invited by my granddaughter who was excited to see me there. Look, Mom, I know you mean well, but you need to understand boundaries. Emma's not your daughter. You don't have automatic rights to her time and attention. Rights. As if loving Emma was some kind of privilege that could be revoked, rather than a bond that had been growing since the day she was born. As if the years I'd spent babysitting her, reading her stories, teaching her to bake cookies counted for nothing now that her parents were divorced. I see, I said quietly. I'm not trying to be harsh, David continued, his voice softening slightly. I just think it would be better for everyone if you gave them some space. Let Sarah manage Emma's social calendar without interference. Interference. That's what my love had become. Interference. I understand, I said again, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. Good. I'm glad we could talk this through like adults. After he hung up, I sat in my kitchen listening to the silence. Outside, I could hear Mrs. Patterson's dog barking playfully as her grandchildren visited for Sunday dinner. Through the thin walls that separated our houses, I caught fragments of laughter, the clink of dishes, the warm hum of family conversation. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to Emma's contact. For a moment, I considered calling her, hearing her voice one more time before I accepted whatever boundaries were being drawn around our relationship. But then I imagined Sarah's face if she knew I was calling, imagined David's irritation if Sarah complained again about my interference. Instead, I deleted Emma's number from my phone. It was a small act, barely noticeable to anyone but me, but sitting there in my empty kitchen, erasing my granddaughter's contact information, felt like the final acknowledgement of what I'd been trying to deny for months. I wasn't losing my family. I'd already lost them. The question now was what I planned to do about it. The days after Emma's recital blended into each other like watercolors in the rain. I found myself moving through the house like a visitor in my own life, going through motions that had once felt purposeful, but now seemed hollow, mechanical. David's schedule became even more erratic. Some nights he didn't come home at all, sending brief texts that offered no explanation. Staying at Jake's tonight, or don't wait up. I stopped cooking dinner for two, stopped setting the table with hope that we might share a meal and conversation. Instead, I made simple things for myself. Soup from a can, toast with jam, tea that grew cold while I sat staring out the kitchen window at other people's lives. Helen called twice, inviting me to her book club and then to a community garden meeting. Both times I found excuses not to go. The effort of pretending to be social, of smiling and making small talk while my heart felt like it was wrapped in cotton, seemed impossible. Better to stay home, to tend my roses, to avoid the awkward questions about how David was adjusting and whether I was enjoying having him back home. The roses were dying. I noticed it on a Thursday morning when the late autumn chill had settled into the garden permanently. The blooms that had been my pride all summer were brown at the edges, their petals scattered on the ground like confetti from a celebration I'd missed. I knelt among them with my pruning shears, cutting away the dead growth with more force than necessary. "You're killing them," I whispered to myself, then immediately felt foolish for talking to flowers, but the words hung in the morning air anyway, heavy with meaning I wasn't ready to examine. Inside, the house echoed with silence. I'd stopped playing music during the day, stopped turning on the television for background noise. The quiet had become my companion, as familiar and constant as my own breathing. In the living room, dust gathered on surfaces I'd once kept spotless. What was the point of cleaning when no one visited, when David barely noticed whether the house was tidy or falling apart? I found myself spending more time in my bedroom, not sleeping but sitting in the chair by the window that looked out over the front yard. From there, I could watch the neighborhood's rhythm, children walking to school in the morning, mail trucks making their rounds, neighbors chatting over fences about weekend plans and home improvement projects. Mrs. Chen from across the street had a new granddaughter visiting. I watched them through my window as the little girl, maybe 4 years old, helped water the flowers in their front garden. Mrs. Chen held the watering can while the child directed the spray with serious concentration, both of them laughing when water splashed their shoes. The scene was so tender, so natural, that watching it felt like pressing on a bruise. That had been me once, with David when he was small. He'd insisted on helping with everything, cooking, cleaning, gardening, even when his help made tasks take twice as long. I'd been patient then, understanding that the relationship mattered more than efficiency, that shared moments were more valuable than perfect results. Now I couldn't remember the last time David and I had done anything together, except exist in the same space, circling each other like polite strangers in a hotel lobby. The photo albums came down from the closet shelf on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I hadn't looked at them in years, hadn't wanted to dwell in the past when I'd still believed the future held promise. But sitting on my bedroom floor with decades of memories spread around me, I found myself searching for clues. When exactly had everything started to change? Here was David at 6, gap-toothed and grinning as he showed off the treehouse we'd built together in the backyard maple. At 10, serious and proud in his Little League uniform, his arm around my waist as we posed after his first home run. 16, reluctantly allowing me to take pictures before his junior prom, rolling his eyes but smiling despite himself. The wedding photos were harder to look at. David and Sarah on their wedding day, surrounded by family and friends, everyone glowing with happiness and hope. There I was in the front row, wearing my best dress and my biggest smile, looking like any proud mother of the groom. Had I been naive then? Or had David's love for me still been real? When exactly had I become an inconvenience instead of a blessing? Emma's baby photos nearly broke me. David holding his newborn daughter with such tenderness, such awe, that it was hard to reconcile that man with the stranger who now lived in my house. And there I was in so many of those early pictures, feeding Emma her first solid food, reading to her in the old rocking chair, teaching her to walk in the backyard while David captured every wobbly step on camera. We'd been a family then, broken by divorce perhaps, complicated by adult disappointments and failed dreams, but still connected by love and shared history. What had happened to that connection? Where did love go when it died? Did it evaporate like water, or did it transform into something else, something harder and more bitter? I closed the albums and put them back in the closet, but kept one photo on my nightstand. Emma at 3 years old, flour in her hair and chocolate chip cookie dough on her fingers, beaming at the camera while I knelt beside her in the kitchen. It was the last picture I remembered David taking of us together, back when my presence in Emma's life was welcomed instead of merely tolerated. The phone stopped ringing. Helen had apparently gotten the message that I wasn't interested in social invitations. David's employer called twice for him, but he was never home to take the messages, so I stopped volunteering to relay them. Emma didn't call at all, whether because Sarah had finally intervened or because my distance had hurt her feelings, I didn't know. The silence around that question was too painful to probe. Evenings were the longest. I'd taken to having dinner earlier and earlier, sometimes as early as 4:30, just to have something to structure the endless hours before bedtime. I ate standing at the kitchen counter or sitting in the breakfast nook, where I could watch the birds at the feeder outside the window. Sparrows mostly, with the occasional cardinal that flashed like a drop of blood against the gray autumn sky. David usually appeared around 9 or 10, moving through the house like he was checking on a property rather than coming home. He'd grab something from the refrigerator, maybe watch television for an hour with the volume low, then disappear upstairs to his room. Sometimes I heard him on the phone, his voice too quiet to make out words but animated enough to suggest he was talking to someone who actually interested him, someone whose conversation he valued. I wondered who that person was. A woman, maybe. Someone younger and less complicated than his ex-wife. Someone who saw him as exciting rather than disappointing. Or perhaps it was just friends, people his own age who shared his interests and ambitions, who didn't carry the burden of having known him when he was young and vulnerable and needed his mother's comfort. The thought didn't hurt as much as it should have. That was the strangest part of this slow retreat from my own life, how little anything seemed to matter anymore. Pain required energy, and I was so tired all the time, tired in my bones, tired in ways that sleep couldn't touch. On Friday night, I heard David come home earlier than usual, his key turning in the lock while I was washing my single dinner dish. He appeared in the kitchen doorway with an expression I couldn't read, not exactly guilty, but something close to it. "Mom, we need to talk." I dried my hands carefully, taking my time with each finger. "About what?" "I'm thinking of making some changes to my living situation." Relief flooded through me so suddenly I had to grip the counter for support. He was leaving. Finally, mercifully, this awkward arrangement was coming to an end. I could have my house back, my solitude, my dignity. "I see," I said, proud of how steady my voice sounded. "The thing is, I've been looking at apartments, and the market's pretty tight right now. Good places are expensive, and with the divorce settlement and everything," he was leading up to something. I could feel it in the way he avoided my eyes, the careful construction of his words. "I was thinking maybe we should consider putting this place on the market. It's a big house for just one person, and the equity would give us both a fresh start. Us both. As if this decision affected us equally, as if I had been consulted rather than simply informed. "Where would I go?" I asked quietly. "There are some nice senior communities around here, places with activities and social programs, where you'd have people your own age to talk to. You might be happier somewhere like that." Senior communities. Places where inconvenient elderly parents could be tucked away safely, visited on holidays and special occasions, managed by professional staff who were paid to care. "I see," I said again. "It makes sense, Mom. This house is too much for you to maintain anyway, and the money would set you up comfortably for the rest of your life." The rest of my life. How long did he imagine that would be? How quickly was he hoping to resolve this problem I'd become? "When?" The word came out as barely a whisper. "Well, nothing's definite yet. I just wanted to run the idea by you first, see how you felt about it. See how I felt about it. As if my feelings had ever mattered in any of his decisions. As if this conversation was anything other than a courtesy call before he moved forward with plans he'd already made. But I surprised myself by nodding calmly, almost serenely. "That sounds very practical." David looked relieved, maybe even a little surprised by my cooperation. "Really? You think it's a good idea?" "Oh, yes," I said, turning back to the sink so he couldn't see my face. "I think it's time for both of us to have exactly what we deserve." He said something else then, something about real estate agents and market timing, but I wasn't really listening. Instead, I was thinking about the small wooden box hidden in the back of my bedroom closet, behind the winter coats and forgotten Christmas decorations, but they didn't know what I had kept all along. That night, after David went upstairs with his laptop and his plans for my displacement, I sat in the darkness of my living room for a long time. The street lamp outside cast pale shadows through the curtains, and I could hear the distant hum of late-night traffic carrying people to destinations I'd never know. For the first time in months, I wasn't sad. The emotion I'd been drowning in, that suffocating mixture of hurt and confusion and desperate hope, had simply evaporated, leaving behind something cleaner and sharper. I felt alert in a way I hadn't experienced since before the fall on the stairs, as if I'd been walking through fog and suddenly stepped into clear air. The wooden box waited in my closet like a patient friend. I'd hidden it there 25 years ago, after my mother's funeral, promising myself I'd never need what was inside. But promises made in grief sometimes prove naive, and people change in ways we never imagine when we're young and trusting. I climbed the stairs quietly, listening for sounds from David's room. His television was on, some late-night talk show that provided background noise for whatever he was really doing on his laptop, probably researching real estate agents or senior communities, making lists and calculations that reduced my life to spreadsheet entries. The box was exactly where I'd left it, wrapped in one of my mother's old scarves. I carried it back downstairs to the kitchen table and sat under the warm light of the pendant lamp my father had installed 40 years ago, back when this house was full of love and laughter, and the kind of hope that survives disappointment. Inside the box were letters, dozens of them, tied with ribbon that had faded from blue to gray over the decades. Love letters, written in the careful handwriting of a young man who'd spent 4 years overseas missing the girl he'd left behind. My father's letters to my mother during the war, saved and treasured until the day she died. I'd read them only once before, the night after her funeral, when grief made me desperate to feel connected to something larger than my own loss. Now I untied the ribbon with steady hands and selected one at random, dated March 15th, 1943. "My darling Eleanor," it began, in the voice of a man I'd barely known as an adult, whose wartime tenderness had been buried under decades of working too hard and worrying too much. "I dreamed about your laugh last night, the way it bubbles up when you find something truly funny. When I come home, I'm going to make you laugh every single day. I promise you that." Had he kept that promise? I tried to remember my parents' marriage through adult eyes rather than a child's limited perspective. Yes, there had been laughter. Even during the lean years when Dad worked 2 jobs, and Mom took in sewing to make ends meet, there had been joy. They'd chosen each other every day for 52 years, through disappointments and failures, and the small cruelties that life visits on everyone. They'd faced hardship as partners, not adversaries. When Dad lost his job at the factory, Mom didn't suggest he was a burden or look for ways to manage him more efficiently. When Mom's arthritis made housework difficult, Dad learned to cook and clean without complaint, understanding that love meant adapting rather than abandoning. I selected another letter, this one from later in the war when my father's unit was stationed in Italy. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm remembering you wrong," he'd written. "If absence is making me imagine you're more beautiful, more perfect than any real woman could be. Then I look at your photograph and realize I'm not remembering enough. No picture could capture the way you move through a room like you're dancing to music only you can hear, or the way you bite your bottom lip when you're thinking hard about something important." The words made me smile, not with sadness for what was lost, but with recognition of what had been real. My father had seen my mother clearly, had loved her not despite her imperfections, but because of the whole person she was. He'd written about her intelligence, her kindness, her terrible cooking and her beautiful singing voice, her stubborn opinions and her generous heart. When had someone last seen me that way? When had anyone looked at me and noted the details that made me uniquely myself, rather than just filling a role in their life? I thought about Ryan from the grocery store, that broken man who'd dismissed his wife via voicemail. I thought about my own marriage to David's father, Robert, which had been kind but never passionate, comfortable but never exciting. Robert had been a good man who'd seen me as a good woman, suitable for the life he'd envisioned for himself. But I couldn't remember him ever writing about my laugh or the way I moved through a room. Maybe that was why David found it so easy to discard me now. I'd never been irreplaceable to his father, had never modeled the kind of love that made abandonment unthinkable. I'd been a suitable wife, a competent mother, a reliable presence, all admirable qualities, but none of them particularly memorable or mournable when circumstances changed. I read more letters, watching my parents' courtship unfold across years of separation and uncertainty. My father wrote about missing the smell of my mother's perfume, about dreaming of dancing with her to the radio in their tiny apartment, about the future they'd build together when the war ended. My mother, in her few surviving replies, had written about learning to fix the car and manage the household finances, about growing stronger and more independent while never forgetting she was loved. They'd both changed during those years apart, had become different people than they'd been when they were young and untested. But they'd grown in the same direction, toward each other rather than away, because they'd chosen to nurture love rather than abandon it when it required effort. By the time I finished reading, dawn was breaking outside the kitchen window. David's alarm would go off soon, and he'd appear in the kitchen expecting breakfast and coffee, taking for granted that I'd continue to serve his needs even as he planned to dispose of me. But something fundamental had shifted during those quiet hours with my parents' letters. I could feel it in my posture, in the steadiness of my breathing, in the way my reflection looked back at me from the dark window, alert and purposeful rather than defeated. I wasn't my mother, and David wasn't my father. This wasn't a love story that had been temporarily interrupted by external circumstances. This was the slow dissolution of a relationship that had never been as strong as I'd convinced myself it was, the natural result of years of taking rather than giving, of convenience masquerading as affection. David appeared in the doorway at 7:15, hair still messy from sleep, expecting to find his breakfast waiting and his mother performing her usual morning routine. Instead, he found me sitting at the kitchen table in yesterday's clothes, surrounded by old letters, drinking coffee from a cup I'd made for myself alone. "What's all this?" he asked, gesturing at the scattered papers. "Family history," I said calmly. "Letters your grandfather wrote to your grandmother during the war." He picked up one of the pages, scanning it with the polite interest he might show to a museum exhibit. I didn't know Grandpa was so—" He paused, searching for the word. "Romantic? Devoted? Capable of seeing your grandmother as a whole person rather than a convenient service provider?" David set the letter down carefully, his expression shifting from sleepy confusion to wariness. "Mom, what's wrong? You seem different this morning." "Different?" Yes, I supposed I was different. The woman who'd been apologizing for her existence, who'd been grateful for scraps of attention and desperate to avoid conflict, had vanished sometime during the night. In her place sat someone older and wiser, someone who'd finally stopped pretending that love could survive without respect, that family meant anything when it was built on exploitation rather than genuine care. "I've been thinking about your suggestion," I said, "about selling the house." Relief flooded his face. "Really? I'm glad you're being reasonable about this." Reasonable. Another word that suggested I'd been unreasonable before, that my attachment to my home and my life had been somehow excessive or irrational. "I think you're right," I continued. "It is time for both of us to have exactly what we deserve." David nodded enthusiastically, already mentally spending his inheritance. "I'll call a real estate agent today. With the market the way it is, we could probably have it sold within a couple of months." "Actually," I said, standing and gathering the letters into a neat stack, "I've decided to handle the arrangements myself." Something in my tone made him look at me more carefully. "What do you mean?" I smiled at him then, the first genuine smile I'd directed his way in months. It felt strange on my face, like a muscle I'd forgotten how to use properly. "I mean, I'll take care of everything, dear. You don't need to worry about it at all." I walked past him toward the stairs, leaving him standing in the kitchen with his mouth slightly open, probably wondering why his docile, manageable mother was suddenly speaking in a tone he didn't recognize. It wasn't pain anymore. It was clarity. The real estate agent David recommended was a polished woman named Miranda, who arrived Tuesday afternoon with a leather portfolio and the kind of aggressive optimism that suggested she worked on commission. She swept through my house like a general surveying a battlefield, making notes on her tablet and muttering about staging and market positioning. "The bones are good," she announced, standing in my living room and gesturing broadly at walls that held 40 years of memories. "But we'll need to depersonalize completely. All these family photos have to go, and this furniture is very dated. We want buyers to envision their own lives here, not feel like they're walking through someone else's museum." David nodded along enthusiastically from his position by the fireplace, as if the photographs she was dismissing so casually weren't documentation of his own childhood, his own history. "How soon can you have everything cleared out?" Miranda asked, turning to me with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to managing elderly homeowners through major life transitions. "Oh, I'll need some time to sort through things," I said mildly. 40 years of accumulation, you understand. "Of course, but we really should aim to have the house market ready within 3 weeks. The fall selling season doesn't last forever." 3 weeks. As if a lifetime of belonging somewhere could be dismantled and discarded in less time than it took to plan a vacation. "I'll do my best." I assured her. After she left, David lingered in the kitchen while I started dinner preparations. He seemed energized by the afternoon's activities, more animated than I'd seen him in months. "Miranda knows her stuff," he said, opening a beer and settling into his usual chair. "She sold the Henderson place down the street for $30,000 over asking price. This house should do even better, with the mature landscaping and the updated kitchen." I nodded while peeling potatoes, letting him continue his calculations about square footage and comparable sales. He was already spending the money in his mind, planning a future that didn't include sharing space with his inconvenient mother. "Have you given any thought to where you'd like to live?" he asked, and I could hear the careful casualness in his voice. This was his way of checking whether I'd investigated the senior communities he'd suggested, whether I was moving forward with the plans he'd made for my life. "I have some ideas," I said, not elaborating. "The place I looked at yesterday has a waiting list, but the woman said if we put down a deposit, you could probably get in by Christmas. It's really nice. They have activities every day, shuttle service to the grocery store, even a little beauty salon on site." A waiting list. He'd not only researched senior communities, he'd actually visited one and discussed my potential residency with the staff. The efficiency of his planning was breathtaking in its callousness. "That sounds very thorough of you." Something in my tone made him glance up from his phone. "I just want to make sure you're taken care of, Mom. These decisions are easier when you have time to plan instead of waiting for a crisis." Crisis. Like my aging was a natural disaster he was preparing for, rather than a normal part of human existence that families typically navigated together. "You're very thoughtful," I said, and meant it in ways he couldn't understand. Over the following days, I began what David assumed was the process of preparing for our move. I sorted through closets and drawers, making neat piles of items for donation, disposal, or keeping. But my real work happened after he left for his increasingly frequent evenings out, when I had privacy to make the phone calls that would matter. The first call was to James Whitfield, the lawyer who'd handled my mother's estate and my own will years ago. James was semi-retired now, but still took calls from longtime clients, and his voice carried the warm familiarity of someone who'd known my family for decades. "Evelyn Morrison," he said with genuine pleasure. "I haven't heard from you in years. How can I help you?" "I need to discuss some changes to my will, James, and I have questions about property law." "Of course. Would you like to come into the office, or would you prefer I visit you at home?" "Actually, I think it would be better if we met somewhere neutral. Are you familiar with Henderson's coffee shop on Main Street?" We arranged to meet Thursday morning at 10, a time when David would be safely at work and unlikely to notice my absence. The second call was more difficult. Sarah's number was still in my phone, though I hadn't used it since the night I'd deleted Emma's contact information in a moment of heartbroken resignation. "Evelyn?" Sarah sounded surprised, perhaps even concerned. "Is everything all right? Is David okay?" The automatic assumption that I would only call in case of emergency stung, but I kept my voice level. "Everyone's fine, dear. I was wondering if you'd have time for coffee sometime this week. Just the two of us." A long pause. Well, yes. I suppose that would be nice. "Is there something specific you wanted to discuss?" "Nothing urgent. I just thought it was time we had a proper conversation." We settled on Friday afternoon at a cafe near her office, neutral territory where neither of us would feel trapped or uncomfortable. The third call required more courage than the first two combined. Emma's school had a main office number, and I'd learned from previous conversations with Sarah that Emma ate lunch at 11:30 every day. "Lincoln Elementary, this is Mrs. Rodriguez." "Hello, this is Emma Patterson's grandmother. I was hoping you could give her a message for me." "Of course. Is this regarding pickup arrangements?" "No, nothing like that. Could you please tell her that Grandma Evie called to say she loves her very much and thinks about her every single day?" A pause. Then Mrs. Rodriguez's voice softened considerably. "Of course, ma'am. I'll make sure she gets that message right after lunch." "Thank you. That means more than you know." Thursday morning arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of weather that made everything look temporary and uncertain. Henderson's coffee shop was nearly empty at 10 o'clock, populated only by a few retirees reading newspapers, and a young mother trying to convince her toddler that his banana was indeed still a banana despite being cut into pieces. James arrived precisely on time, carrying the same leather briefcase he'd used for as long as I'd known him. His hair had gone completely white since our last meeting, but his eyes were as sharp as ever, and his handshake conveyed both warmth and competence. "You look well, Evelyn," he said as we settled into a corner booth. "How are you managing on your own?" "Actually, I'm not on my own. David moved back in after his divorce." James nodded thoughtfully. "That must be nice, having family close by." Something in my expression must have contradicted my words, because he leaned forward slightly, his lawyer instincts engaged. "But that's not why you called me, is it?" "No, it's not." I took a breath, steadying myself for the conversation that would set everything in motion. "James, I need to understand my options regarding the house. If David wanted to sell it, could he force me to do so?" "Absolutely not. The property is titled solely in your name. Has been since Robert passed away. David has no legal claim to it whatsoever. Even if I were declared incompetent somehow?" James's eyebrows rose. "Is there reason to believe someone might pursue guardianship proceedings against you? Because based on this conversation, I'd say you're sharper than most people half your age. I don't think it will come to that, but I want to be prepared for every possibility." We spent the next hour discussing property law, estate planning, and the various ways adult children sometimes attempted to manipulate elderly parents into making decisions that benefited the younger generation at the expense of the older. James had seen it all, he assured me, and the legal protections for property owners were stronger than many people realized. "Is there something else you'd like to tell me, Evelyn?" he asked as our meeting wound down. "Sometimes it helps to have a neutral party understand the full situation." I considered his offer, then shook my head. "Not yet. But I may need to call you again soon. Anytime. And Evelyn, whatever you're planning, be careful. Family disputes over money can get very ugly very quickly." "I know," I said, "but sometimes ugly is preferable to invisible." That evening, David came home earlier than usual, his mood buoyant in a way that made me instantly suspicious. He actually whistled while he grabbed a beer from the refrigerator, and he sat down at the kitchen table instead of disappearing immediately upstairs. "Good news," he announced. "Miranda called today. She thinks we can list the house for even more than she originally estimated. The market is crazy right now." "How wonderful." "She wants to bring a photographer next week to take the listing photos, so we'll need to have all your personal stuff cleared out by then." Next week. The timeline was accelerating, his eagerness becoming more obvious. "That does seem quite fast," I said carefully. "Strike while the iron's hot, right? No point in dragging this out longer than necessary." Necessary for whom? I wondered, but didn't ask. "Of course," I agreed, though I should mention I've been thinking about our conversation regarding senior communities. His attention sharpened. "Yeah? What about it?" "Well, I realize I've been a bit naive about the financial realities. Moving into one of those places is quite expensive, isn't it?" "The good ones are, yeah. But Mom, you'll have plenty of money from the house sale. More than enough to live comfortably for the rest of your life." The rest of my life. There it was again, that phrase that reduced my future to a manageable time frame, a problem with a foreseeable end. "I suppose you're right," I said, "though I have been wondering about one thing." "What's that?" I met his eyes directly, my voice perfectly calm, perfectly reasonable. "I've been wondering exactly when you stopped loving me." The question hung in the air between us like a live wire. David's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, guilt, irritation, and finally that carefully neutral mask he'd perfected over the past several months. "Mom, that's a ridiculous thing to say. Of course I love you. Do you? You're my mother." "That's not the same thing though, is it?" For a long moment, we simply looked at each other across the kitchen table where I'd fed him thousands of meals, where I'd helped him with homework and listened to his teenage heartbreaks and celebrated his successes. Somewhere in that gaze, I saw the exact moment he realized that his manageable, predictable mother had been replaced by someone who might not be quite so easy to control. "We should probably get some rest," he said finally. "Tomorrow's going to be busy." "Yes," I thought as he walked away. Tomorrow was going to be very busy indeed. Friday afternoon found me sitting across from Sarah in a cafe that smelled of roasted coffee beans and fresh pastries, watching my former daughter-in-law fidget with her napkin while she tried to understand why I'd requested this meeting. She looked tired in the way that single mothers always do, her professional blazer slightly wrinkled, and her makeup touched up hastily in the car. Despite everything that had happened, I felt a surge of sympathy for her. "Thank you for coming," I said, stirring honey into my tea with deliberate calm. "I know your time is precious." "Of course, though I have to admit, I wasn't sure what you wanted to discuss." Sarah's voice carried the careful politeness she'd perfected since the divorce. respectful but distant, acknowledging our shared history without committing to a shared future. Emma, mostly, and David. And some things I think you deserve to know. Something in my tone made her set down her coffee cup and give me her full attention. Is David in some kind of trouble? Not the kind you mean? I reached into my purse and pulled out a small digital recorder, the kind lawyers use for depositions. Before we talk, I need to ask you something. Do you remember the day you and David told me about the divorce? Sarah's face softened slightly. Yes. You were so kind about it, so understanding. You said you just wanted both of us to be happy. I meant that, but there's something else I said that day, something I'm not sure you heard clearly. I pressed play on the recorder, and my own voice filled the space between us, captured from a conversation 6 months ago that felt like a lifetime. If you ever need anything for Emma, anything at all, please don't hesitate to call me. I know the divorce changes things between you and David, but it doesn't change the fact that I'm Emma's grandmother, and I love her unconditionally. Sarah listened to the playback with growing confusion. Evelyn, I remember you saying that. I was grateful for it. Then perhaps you can explain why Emma hasn't been allowed to call me since the recital. Why you told her I was too old and tired to be part of her celebrations. The color drained from Sarah's face. What are you talking about? I never said anything like that. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to the recording I'd made of Emma's call weeks ago, the one where she'd innocently repeated her father's words. Sarah's expression grew more stricken with each sentence as she heard her daughter explaining that Daddy said old people get tired easily, that Grandma Evie probably couldn't handle crowded events or long drives. David told her this? Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. Among other things. I played another recording, this one from the phone conversation where David had accused me of interfering with Emma's life, of overstepping boundaries and making Sarah uncomfortable. Sarah listened with her hand over her mouth, shaking her head in disbelief. Evelyn, I never complained about you. Never. In fact, I've been worried about you, wondering why you seem to be pulling away from Emma. David said you were having a hard time adjusting to the divorce, that you needed space to process everything. The pieces clicked together with devastating clarity. David had been playing us against each other, telling each of us that the other wanted distance, orchestrating our separation while positioning himself as the protective son and caring father, managing two difficult women. There's more, I said quietly, and played the recording I'd captured the morning in the garden, David's voice drifting through the kitchen window as he described me as convenient free housekeeping, as someone who actually believed she was helping him when really he was using her. Sarah looked physically sick. Oh my God, Evelyn, I had no idea. I thought... He told me you wanted to focus on your own interests now that he was back home, that having Emma around reminded you too much of his failed marriage. The only thing his failed marriage reminded me of, I said gently, was how much I missed having my granddaughter in my life. We sat in silence for several minutes, while Sarah processed the scope of David's manipulations. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with anger and guilt. How long has he been doing this? Lying to both of us? I suspect it started shortly after he moved back in, maybe even before the divorce was final. I paused, gathering courage for what came next. Sarah, there's something else. Something worse. I pulled up the video on my phone, the one I'd discovered by accident after my fall on the stairs. The one that had been recorded automatically when my phone hit the floor, capturing not just my tumble, but the sound that had preceded it, and the laughter that had followed. This was recorded 3 weeks ago, I said, handing her the phone. I fell down the stairs and David rushed to help me, or so I thought. Sarah watched the brief video with growing horror. You could hear my startled cry as I lost my balance, the sound of my body hitting the wooden steps. And then, clear as daylight, David's laughter. Not concerned laughter, not nervous laughter, but the cold, amused sound of someone watching something he found entertaining. He was laughing, Sarah breathed. While you were hurt, he was laughing. The phone started recording when it hit the floor. I didn't discover this video until days later when I was looking through my photo gallery. My voice remained steady, matter of fact. At first, I told myself I was misunderstanding what I was hearing, that it couldn't possibly be what it sounded like. But it was. Yes, it was. Sarah handed the phone back to me with shaking hands. Evelyn, I am so sorry. I had no idea David was capable of this level of cruelty. I don't think I knew either. Not really. I've spent months making excuses for him, telling myself he was just stressed from the divorce, that he'd eventually remember how to love his mother again. I tucked the phone back into my purse with careful precision. But some things can't be explained away, can they? What are you going to do? I'm going to give him exactly what he wants, I said, and exactly what he deserves. That evening, I cooked David's favorite meal, pot roast with roasted vegetables, the same dinner I'd made for his birthday every year since he was 7 years old. I set the table with our good china, the set my mother had passed down to me, and I even lit candles like we were celebrating something special. David arrived home to find this elaborate spread waiting for him, and for the first time in months, he smiled at me with something approaching genuine warmth. "Wow, Mom, this is incredible. What's the occasion?" "I wanted to thank you," I said, serving him a generous portion while he settled into his chair, "for everything you've done for me these past few months." He looked pleased but slightly confused. "You don't need to thank me. I'm your son." "Yes, you are." I sat down across from him with my own small serving. "And I'm your mother, which is why I need to tell you something important." "Sure, what's on your mind?" I reached into my pocket and pulled out the digital recorder, setting it on the table between us like a centerpiece. David's expression shifted from relaxed satisfaction to wariness. "I've been doing some thinking about our conversation regarding the house sale," I began conversationally, "about senior communities and my limitations, and making sure we both get what we deserve." "Okay." David's fork paused halfway to his mouth. I realized I've been very naive about a lot of things. About trust, about family relationships, about the difference between being loved and being convenient. I pressed play on the recorder, and his own voice filled the dining room. That callous conversation from the garden where he'd described me as unpaid domestic help, who actually thought she was helping him. David went very still, his face cycling through surprise, embarrassment, and finally a kind of cold calculation. "Mom, you don't understand the context." "Oh, but I do." I stopped that recording and started another one, his laughter from the day I fell down the stairs. The sound was even more chilling in the quiet dining room, echoing off the walls where his school pictures and family photos bore witness to his cruelty. I wasn't laughing at you falling. There was something on TV. David, my voice cut through his stammering with quiet authority. Stop lying. We're past that now. He set down his fork and leaned back in his chair, and for the first time since his return, I saw him clearly. Not the grieving son I'd been making excuses for, but the calculating man he'd become. "Fine," he said, his voice taking on that flat, businesslike tone I'd heard him use on phone calls with people he considered beneath him. "What do you want?" "I want you to pack your things and leave my house. Tonight." "Your house?" He laughed, but it was ugly now. Nothing like the warm laughter I remembered from his childhood. "Mom, be realistic. You can't afford this place on your own. You need me." "Actually, I don't." I stood up and walked to the kitchen counter, where I'd laid out several documents James Whitfield had prepared for me. "These are copies of the property deed, tax records, and mortgage documents showing that this house is mine completely. You have no legal claim to it whatsoever. I'm your heir. You were my heir." I handed him another document. "This is my new will filed yesterday. The house and all my assets now go to Emma's education fund, with Sarah as the trustee." The silence that followed was deafening. David's face went through a range of expressions: shock, fury, disbelief, before settling into something cold and calculating that I'd never seen before, but suspected had always been there, hidden beneath the mask of dutiful son. "You can't do this." "I already have." I gathered the documents with steady hands. "You have until tomorrow morning to collect your belongings. After that, I'm changing the locks." "I'm your son," he said, his voice rising with desperate anger. "You can't just throw me out like some stranger. You stopped being my son the day you started seeing me as a convenient service provider rather than a human being who deserved your love and respect." I met his eyes directly, my voice calm and final. "Tomorrow morning, David. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." As I walked toward the stairs, I heard him call after me, his voice cracking with what might have been genuine panic. "Mom, please, we can work this out. I never meant— I was just frustrated about the divorce, about everything falling apart. I didn't mean any of it." I paused at the bottom of the stairs and turned back to look at him one last time. This man I'd raised and loved and sacrificed for, who'd repaid that devotion with calculated cruelty. "The saddest part, David, is that I don't think you're lying now. I think you really believe your own excuses. But some wounds cut too deep to heal, and some trust, once broken, can never be repaired. I went upstairs and locked my bedroom door, listening to the sounds of him moving through the house below, opening drawers, making phone calls, perhaps finally understanding that the convenient arrangement he'd taken for granted was ending not on his timeline, but on mine. David left the next morning while I was watering my roses in the front garden. I watched from behind the curtain of climbing jasmine as he loaded his belongings into his car, with the efficient movements of someone who'd been planning this departure longer than he'd admit. 3 trips from house to trunk, and 43 years of being his mother was reduced to whatever could fit in a sedan. He didn't knock on the door to say goodbye, didn't leave a note or attempt one final conversation. He simply drove away, and I found myself oddly grateful for his silence. Some endings are cleaner without words, without the false promises and hollow apologies that only serve to make the person leaving feel better about themselves. I finished tending to my roses, cutting away the dead blooms, feeding the roots, preparing them for winter's dormancy, while the locksmith I'd called worked on changing the house keys. By noon, my home truly belonged to me again, protected by new locks and the kind of peace that comes from no longer sharing space with someone who sees you as an inconvenience. The phone rang 3 times that afternoon. The first call was from a number I didn't recognize, probably David, calling from his office or a friend's phone, testing whether I'd answer if I didn't know it was him. I let it go to voicemail and deleted the message without listening. The second call was from Helen, my neighbor, whose voice bubbled with the kind of excitement that suggested good news. "Evelyn, dear, I just saw David loading up his car this morning. Does this mean you're finally free to join my book club? We're reading the most wonderful novel about a woman who reinvents her life after her children grow up and forget her." I smiled at the irony. "Yes, Helen, I think I'd like that very much." "Marvelous. We meet Tuesday evenings at 7. "And Evelyn, I'm so glad you're finally putting yourself first." The third call came just as I was preparing dinner for one, a simple salad with vegetables from my garden, eaten at the kitchen table while I watched the sunset paint my backyard in shades of gold and amber. "Grandma Evie?" Emma's voice was small and uncertain, like she wasn't sure she was allowed to call. "Hello, sweetheart," I said, my heart lifting in ways I'd forgotten were possible. "How was school today?" "Mommy said I could call you anytime I want now. She said there was a big misunderstanding, and Daddy was being mean to you, and she was sorry she believed him instead of talking to you herself, out of the mouths of babes. Your mommy is a very wise woman. Are you still mad at Daddy? Mommy says sometimes grown-ups do things that hurt people they love, and sometimes sorry isn't enough to fix it." I considered how to answer this honestly without burdening an 8-year-old with the full weight of adult disappointments. "I'm not mad anymore, Emma. Mad is too much work, and I've decided to spend my energy on people who make me happy instead. Like me? Especially like you." We talked for 20 minutes about her day at school, her upcoming Halloween costume, her friend Lucy's birthday party next weekend. Normal, wonderful, grandmother-granddaughter conversation that felt like stepping back into sunshine after months of living under clouds. "Grandma Evie, can I come visit you next weekend? Mommy says she'll drive me over if you want company." "I would love that more than anything, sweetheart. We'll bake cookies and read stories and maybe work in the garden together." After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen listening to the house settle around me, the familiar creaks and sighs of a home that had sheltered 3 generations of my family, that had witnessed births and deaths, celebrations and sorrows, the whole messy, beautiful progression of human life. For the first time in months, the silence felt peaceful rather than empty. The weeks that followed established new rhythms, healthier patterns that reminded me who I was when I wasn't busy apologizing for my existence. Helen's book club became a Tuesday evening highlight, filled with thoughtful discussions and the kind of laughter that comes from women who've lived long enough to find humor in life's absurdities. I volunteered at Emma's school library, reading to kindergartners who listened with the rapt attention children reserve for stories told by someone who genuinely loves them. The librarian, Mrs. Patterson, mentioned that she'd noticed an immediate improvement in several students' attitudes toward reading after my sessions began. "You have a gift," she said one Thursday afternoon as we reshelved picture books. "Have you ever considered teaching?" I hadn't, but the idea planted itself in my mind like a seed waiting for the right season to grow. Emma visited every other weekend, arriving Friday afternoons with overnight bags and enough energy to power a small city. We established our own traditions. Saturday morning pancakes shaped like butterflies, afternoon garden work where she learned the names of every flower and herb I grew, evening story time where she practiced reading to me with the serious concentration of someone mastering an important skill. "I'm going to be a teacher like you when I grow up," she announced one Sunday morning while we watered the tomatoes together. "I'm not a teacher, sweetheart." "Yes, you are. You teach me about plants and cooking and how to be brave when things get scary. That's what teachers do." Sarah proved to be a surprisingly good friend once David's manipulations were no longer poisoning our interactions. We met for coffee every few weeks, sharing the comfortable companionship of two women who'd both learned hard lessons about trusting the wrong person's version of reality. "I keep thinking I should have seen through his lies sooner," she said one afternoon as we watched Emma play on the cafe's outdoor playground. "How could you have known? He was telling each of us exactly what we expected to hear, that the other person was pulling away, that he was protecting us from uncomfortable truths. It was sophisticated manipulation. Do you think he ever really loved either of us?" I considered the question while Emma demonstrated her monkey bar skills for our approval. "I think he loved the idea of us. I was the devoted mother who made him feel important, and you were the perfect wife who made him look successful. But love requires seeing someone as they actually are, not just as they serve your needs." "When did you realize that?" "The night I read my parents' old letters. My father wrote about my mother like she was fascinating, like he couldn't wait to discover new things about her personality and thoughts. David never looked at me that way. I was just mom, predictable, manageable, useful." 3 months after David's departure, I received a letter from him. Not a phone call or a text, but an actual handwritten letter delivered through the postal service. His penmanship was as careful and controlled as I remembered from his childhood homework assignments. "Dear Mom," it began, "I've been doing a lot of thinking since our conversation, and I realize I owe you an apology. The divorce was harder on me than I wanted to admit, and I took out my frustrations on the person who least deserved it. You were nothing but kind and supportive, and I repaid that kindness with selfishness and cruelty. I understand why you felt you had to ask me to leave, and I respect your decision about the house and the will. I hope someday you'll consider giving me a chance to prove that I can be the son you deserve, but I also understand if that day never comes. Some mistakes are too big to forgive, and I've made more than my share. I want you to know that Emma asks about you constantly, and I've told her she should call you whenever she wants. Whatever problems you and I have shouldn't affect her relationship with the grandmother who loves her so much. I hope you're happy, Mom. I hope you're finding the peace you deserve." It was signed simply, David, without the love that had ended his letters home from college. Without any assumption of affection, he no longer had the right to claim. I read the letter twice, then filed it away in the box with my parents' correspondence. Not because I was ready to forgive, but because it was part of the story now, part of the record of what had happened, and how we'd all moved forward from it. Forgiveness, I'd learned, wasn't something you owed people who hurt you. It was something you chose for yourself. When and if you were ready to let go of anger that was taking up space in your heart, you'd rather use for joy. Maybe someday I'd be ready. Maybe not. But the beauty of finally understanding my own worth was that I no longer had to decide based on what other people needed from me. 6 months after that morning when I'd sat in my kitchen reading my father's letters, I found myself in my garden again. This time, with Emma kneeling beside me as we planted bulbs that would bloom next spring. Daffodils and tulips, crocuses and hyacinths, flowers that would push through winter's hardship to announce that life persists, that beauty returns, that endings can be beginnings if you're brave enough to plant seeds in the dark. "Why do we put them in the ground now if they won't grow until spring?" Emma asked, her small hands carefully placing each bulb in the holes we'd dug together. "Because some things need time in the dark before they can bloom," I explained. "The cold and the waiting make them stronger, make their colors brighter when they finally reach the light." "Like you, Grandma Evie?" I looked at this wise 8-year-old, this child who saw truth with the clarity that comes from not yet learning to make excuses for cruelty, and felt my heart expand with gratitude for the second chances life offers when you're brave enough to claim them. "Yes, sweetheart, exactly like me." As we worked together in the rich, dark soil, I thought about the silence that had once felt so heavy in my house, so full of words that should have been spoken, and love that should have been shared. That silence was different now, not empty, but full of possibilities I hadn't dared to imagine, relationships I hadn't had the courage to nurture, dreams I'd forgotten I was allowed to have. The sun was setting behind us as we finished planting the last of the bulbs, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that reminded me of my mother's favorite roses. Emma was chattering about her upcoming school play, about the butterfly costume she was making with her mother's help, about whether I would be able to attend the performance. "Of course I'll be there," I assured her. Wild horses couldn't keep me away. And as we gathered our gardening tools and headed inside to wash the soil from our hands, I realized that I'd finally learned the difference between the silence of isolation and the silence of peace. Sometimes silence is the loudest truth,